Thank you very much, Charles, for the prize, but particularly for your critical friendship since '68, which has been extremely meaningful background against my whole career. And I am very honest when I say that without you, I would have been a much sloppier architect. Basically, I'm having difficulty with awards. They are always a little bit like a wake. And therefore I try to find a way to show that I'm still alive. And what I'm kind of trying to do is to give a lecture about 4 unrealized ambitions that I still carry, and time will tell whether I will kind of succeed in these ambitions. So since we also have a conversation and also a conversation with the audience, I'll simply proceed. 4 ambitions. It's probably a good thing for an architect to be born in this city at this moment, because the whole idea of change is radically present, and the whole idea of reconstruction is equally present. It's probably also a good idea for the parents of an architect to take their child to a completely a country on the other side of the world. It's probably a good idea to be taken to Indonesia, to a recently independent country, with no sympathy for the Dutch, and therefore an obligation to go and live like an Indonesian and speak Indonesian, and therefore have a kind of early experience with other cultures, other religions. It's also probably a good idea to be in Paris in '68, not as a revolutionary, but as a journalist and as a kind of witness to a process. And it is probably also a good idea to be an emerging architect at the end of the Cold War. Maybe this is an unusual kind of theory, but I think the Cold War was a moment of exceptional mutual intelligence and preoccupation, when one half of the world knew more about the other half than currently is the case. So it was a kind of charged condition that I think was important. It is probably also important to start my real career at the fall of the wall at the end of the 80s, at a moment where, as is well known, the end of history was imminent. Fukuyama proclaimed it, and where the expectation was that kind of after this bloc organization, the West, the East, and the non-aligned, the entire world would turn into a neoliberal paradise. But the market economy intervened, and the market economy had kind of drastic consequences for architecture. You could be a respectable architect in the late 50s by doing this kind of work, but to be an architect in the early part of the 21st century, you had to be a salesman and sell in very often difficult conditions your work. There was no a priori effect. I think the market economy made it impossible to be an architect like this person that I always look at with envy, because this architect is obviously not a very interesting person. He is witnessing the blueprints of his design, but he has his back to the building that is being kind of realized, in the full confidence that the building behind him will be the faithful execution of the plans in front of him. And he also knows that that his work is serving mankind. And I'm very envious of this person, because this certainty, both the certainty that things will be as you want them, but also that you serve a noble purpose, we don't have anymore, and this world has become inaccessible to us. We have draw a lot of attention but this is an analysis that our office made of covers of Time with architects on the covers. Then we saw a lot of architects on the covers in the decade of the 30s, a lot of architects in the decade of the 50s, 40s, the 50s, the 60s, very good for architects. And the last architect on the cover of Time was in 1979, Philip Johnson, Charles and Bob Stern's very good friend. And the last moment of an architect on the cover of Time was at the beginning of Wall Street's incredible explosion. So I think that this analysis really proves once and for all that although we gained in notoriety, we lost in credibility, and that the market economy is the fault. 9/11 exacerbated this condition, in my view, because it introduced, or was the beginning of a kind of bifurcation or division of the world in a part that is not, if not shrinking, at least struggling, and another part that is very vigorously developing, and developing since we are struggling, not in a way which reflects our values, but on the contrary, exploring all kinds of autonomous values on its own. So where at the end of communism this could be the prognosis, or actually was the prognosis, we are now kind of in a situation that prognosis seems to be kind of way too optimistic, and that we are in a much more complex environment than we thought at the time, and we are operating in this condition, and where we have a kind of patchwork of different political systems, a patchwork of values and religions, all of them incredibly intricately connected and therefore hard to understand and to entirely decipher. And this is the field in which we operate right now. And so I basically want to show unrealized ambitions, and this is one of them. I'm incredibly interested in looking at the world, or this part of the world, in the same way as Herodotus, and to see if connections cannot be made between all these different parts. And the blue dots are where we're working. And that kind of really implies that for each of our works, there is, apart from the work itself, an effort and an attempt to also intervene in the culture, or intervene in the religion, or intervene even in the political system. I think there's a kind of really serious obligation to communicate. I believe that architecture can be one of the tools of that communication. It rarely is, unfortunately, but I think architecture is involved in almost any of these fields and has something to say about it. So for me, CCTV is not kind of simply a building or a form, but it's a form of engagement, and particularly an engagement, as in this case, for instance, with Chinese engineers. CCTV is a building where gravity does not work according to straightforward Marxist laws, that it goes through the shortest path from the top to the bottom. But gravity it's an engagement with gravity, an engagement that initially shocked the Chinese engineers, the 150 professors who had to check our work, and whom we met over 2 or 3 years in an intense dialogue, where in the end we could convince them that what we did was not frivolous, was not irresponsible, but was in itself a gesture to liberating Newtonian physics, and a gesture to imagine structure in a more imaginative way. Of course, it's not my work alone, but I work with Cecil Beaumont, who had the prize before. So for me, this is a kind of totally undiscussed part of architecture, but it was a very crucial part of architecture. In a similar way in which we're now working in Doha on many different but interconnected ways in Qatar. And I would like to simply take Qatar as a kind of prototype, perhaps, of what is possible in this new world and how each of these worlds is radically different. what is truly amazing and barely realized in Qatar is that on 2 million people, only 300,000 are Qataris. And that therefore, where we are struggling with immigrants and countries like France are really in a kind of state of crisis through immigration, we have to admire other countries that are living with immigration on a colossal scale, where they are absolutely themselves a minority, and therefore it's impossible, apart from all the other things you can say about conditions, etc., to not also look at this as a part of tolerance. Qatar is a country that focuses on many different, seemingly incompatible entities. Here, the royal family celebrates itself by acquiring the soccer cup. It invests on an enormous scale on art, and it is hyper politically active. So that you could say that Qatar has a colossal footprint. It's a tiny city-state with a footprint that is now global, and that kind of simply creates a layering of all these different involvements, even to the point where it's correcting Europe's problems with an investment of 150 million euro in the banlieue of Paris. So what is Qatar? A country that no longer keeps categories that we keep separate. For Qatar, this encounter is as important as this encounter. This is the daughter of the royal family bicycling with Jacques Anquetil, the former winner of the Tour de France. And what the country is trying to do is create a kind of patchwork of different forms of excellence. And this is public art there against the skyline. And it really makes me think, and gives me a feeling that what we're witnessing here is a kind of 21st century interpretation of statehood and politics. Because where we keep all these categories separate and clearly as autonomous, in Qatar they create a kind of single bandwidth, a continuous form of entertainment, education, values, and other conditions. And for me, it is kind of very exciting to be almost like an acupuncturist involved in many of these operations that try to become a single entity. And so this is a kind of small prototype of how I would like to read our involvement in this moment of globalization, where the kind of cementing, perhaps, relationships between different countries is crucial. A second ambition that I have not given up is the ambition to do a book on Lagos. And I will kind of explain why. I first went to Lagos in '96, and that was a strange moment. Because it was the moment that Nigeria was doing, at the end of a series of dictatorships, incredibly badly. It was a moment that the State Department discouraged people to go. It was a moment that Lagos was almost entirely unknown. You couldn't look at it in any of the media. So it was really a low point of its existence. At the same time, the fact that I, as an architect, relatively well known, would visit it was treated not by Lagosians, but mostly by the outside, with incredible suspicion. And I have to admit that the reason I didn't write a book is that I was kind of finally intimidated by this suspicion and all the forms it took. What is unbelievably moving and gripping about Lagos is that what seems at first sight an incredible chaos and turmoil on the ground. It seems as half of the city is permanently burning. There is an incredible amount of movement. There are barely any kind of recognizable municipal services, and there is a kind of hyperactivity. And so in order to understand what we were seeing, we were constantly forced to, on the one hand, look on the ground, and this is a typical ground image, very hard to decipher, and from above, because then if you look from above, you can somehow see that what looks at first sight maybe as chaos is actually a structured movement of tree trunks that arrive, that are the sawdust is burned, and that are then turning into planks. And the more we looked at Lagos, so here is a kind of similar example, a rubbish dump, with some human life. You see it here, very hard to distinguish. And if you look better, actually in the second look, you see that it's not simply rubbish, but that there is also a process going on of a degree of consolidation and a degree perhaps even of recycling. You see that from tin, new things are being made, so that in the end, image like this one, for me, is a kind of perplexing image where you both see chaos and order in a kind of mutual embrace. And what you also see is that this embrace is perhaps, or this condition that at first sight seems to be completely spontaneous, is actually perhaps framed by elements of infrastructure, or maybe you should say dysfunctional elements of former infrastructure. So what seems utterly spontaneous is perhaps designed. And what we discovered on our journeys was that actually, yes, in the 60s and the 70s, a design had been made for Lagos by German engineers, and that explains the huge wrist that had kind of tried to capture the entire city in a kind of network of infrastructure, and it was kind of probably not a coincidence that all these most intense activities were taking place in the kind of remnants and pockets of that infrastructure. So for me it was a kind of incredibly intense learning experience, because what I first thought was self-organization, which at that time was a kind of very highly fashionable concept, and where I first thought that simply the city was displaying a kind of form of intelligence and a form of creative action that was absent in our societies. If we have to take perhaps 30 important decisions in a certain day, in Lagos it was clear that people probably had to take 5,000 decisions kind of constantly to survive. That actually the situation was much more complex, because it was an amalgamation of self-organization, crisis, and the former organization of modernism, all in one. And so the reason that I didn't write the book was kind of was a really incredible campaign where I was kind of simply my activity had been interpreted as an incredible coward, too intimidated to leave his car, and out of fear renting the president's helicopter, but in fact we had been going kind of from ground to air in a continuous alternation. And so as a very confrontational kind of moment, on my last visit to Lagos, I met the new governor of Lagos, who received me, and I have to kind of really embarrassingly say, as a hero, because before his election, someone gave him the video that I had made about my journey for his birthday. That night he couldn't sleep. The picture it suggested of Lagos had kept him awake. Next day he gave illegal copies to all his collaborators. This is the city that we will inherit. The video had defined a large part of his program. Suddenly I sensed violent goosebumps. Is this the most emphatic confirmation of a professional usefulness I've ever encountered? But anyway, so for me the wrenching movement of this discredit in the West and credit in a different location has been, a persistent a persistent effect, I would say, which of course is also on one hand scary, but on the other hand intimidating. Preservation is another kind of recent field that I want to kind of really decipher, and which I want to redefine. And I say it in a kind of arrogant way, and the reason is that I really believe that there are issues in preservation that are currently so perverse and so decadent that it really is a world that needs to be kind of reinvented, or particularly maybe better to be redefined. When we started with preservation, we looked first when the first laws of preservation were invented, and then the first one was a few years after the French Revolution, and the second one was in the middle of the Victorian Industrial Revolution in England. And of course, there's a logical connection between wanting to preserve a revolution, because in a revolution you destroy everything, so what you want to keep is urgent. But when we looked at the contemporary events and contemporary inventions of these two laws, we discovered that actually these two laws defining preservation coincided with a whole avalanche or a groundswell of modern inventions that could be said to define the whole idea of modernity. So that rather than kind of resisting modernity, preservation is an aspect of modernity. And when we understood that, it became the first key to looking at preservation in a new way. We also looked at the interval between the present and the substance to be preserved. In 1882, it was about 2,000 years. In 1912, it was only 200 years. In the mid-60s, it was kind of reduced to 30 years. And in 2007, the moment of preservation coincided with the present. So I venture a prognosis that preservation will no longer be an activity of retrospective decision, but more activity of prospective decision. You have to know that you want to build something to preserve it. And again, with this logic, we felt we were also introducing perhaps a new domain. We looked at the apparatus that tells us that we need to preserve things, and basically it's a kind of, again, the same form of groundswell, more and more institutions, more and more NGOs that pressure preservation. And this is the scale of UNESCO World Heritage Site, their escalation, their distribution across different continents. But here, all the heritage sites that are in the pipeline. So there's a kind of huge wave of preservation still to come. And when we made a kind of sincere attempt to look at the scale of preservation in the world, and in this case we look both at physical substance, history, and nature, we discovered that about 12% of the world's surface, the entire surface, including the sea, is under some regime of preservation, so that we are facing an issue that we are all full of the cliche that the world is changing so fast, but at the same time, inside that there is a kind of world of radical stasis. So on the one hand, radical transformation and radical stasis, and we are not ready to theorize that kind of, again, wrenching movement between the two. We then looked at Wall Street. We always look at Wall Street. The number of World Heritage Sites that show exactly the parallel increase with Wall Street, and the number of tourism. Numbers of tourism, and so in these kind of fatal embrace of heritage, money and the economy, I think another story is kind of revealed. And if I look at my own preferences in preservation or my own experiences with preservation, I would say that I like my own preservation role. Maybe one of the most beautiful moments of preservation is this casts of bodies burned in Pompeii, found in the ash and kind of simply represented in clay. Another amazing image of preservation is an abandoned school in Chernobyl, decades later, but still completely intact. And I think it's these moments of preservation that are unbelievably powerful and forceful. In a similar way, preservation, this is an image of a store in Beirut, a store in Damascus. It could be hundreds of years old, and you kind of realize that a particular way of life that again could be hundreds or even thousands of years old has been present here and is still present. And this is a store next door in Beirut that is preserved and turned into a kind of fashion house with all the kind of implements of fashion and including technology. So an involvement with preservation must, for me, in a large extent, be a campaign against preservation, because somehow real preservation would be an art or a science that was able to maintain this condition over time and avoid the transformation of this condition in kind of something much more recognizable. This is one of my favorite corners in the world. I cannot exactly explain why, but I would love to preserve it. But I also know that there is simply no framework or no argument or no economy or no ideology and no political system that would ever support me in my thesis. And therefore, I've been kind of thinking, and we have been thinking in how we could find other models of preservation. This is a kind of test on Beijing. Preservation typically preserves the beautiful, the old, and the important. Important architects are preserved, but the strongest argument for preservation is, of course, that you are able to remember history or that you are able to reconstruct history. And if you only preserve the beautiful, of course you distort history. So this was an essay to say, in order to do pure preservation, you should have a kind of random point grid of preserved areas, so that whatever happens around it, you will also preserve a particular moment. And whether that moment was ugly, mediocre, compromised, absurd, you preserve it so that later generations are able to enjoy it and have the kind of intelligence of history there in front of their eyes. And the same thing, you could also kind of preserve a wedge of museum. So experimenting with this direction inspired me and inspired us to look at the Hermitage Museum, which is a kind of huge museum which was facing the issue of extending its properties with one new museum, which was incredibly decrepit, made me produce a number of projects where I was looking into the possibility of preserving decay as a meaningful issue. This building had been used by the Soviet army. Wherever you looked, you found kind of Soviet pornography, Soviet cartoons, Soviet strips, Soviet everything. And so the combination of dilapidation, destruction, debris was so important after the arrival of the Putin regime that actually it seemed important to make it part of the museum. So therefore we did kind of experimentations that in the most dilapidated parts of the museum you could somehow show the most important art, maybe also ancient, so that there would be a resonance of ages. Of course, again, a kind of preservation project that went nowhere, but still the mentality is kind of embodied in a number of things and arguments that we hold dearly. I want to finally talk about the fourth ambition, which is an ambition to look at the countryside, which we are recently looking at kind of very carefully. Of course, our career seems dedicated to singing the praises of the metropolis. Our name is about the metropolis. We looked at New York, the archetypal metropolis, and seemingly we have been kind of betting on the right horse, because the cliche that more than half of mankind now lives in urban conditions is well established by now. We all know it, and we have contributed to it, to the equation that the world is a city, through our earlier work. But if you look carefully, and this is an average newspaper magazine shelf in an average European city, and you eliminate everything which is not connected to the countryside, there's a kind of amazing section that is dealing with the countryside. So clearly countryside is still a viable and even urgent entity, in the sense that about 50% of magazines is dealing with it. 2% of the surface is now concerned with cities or occupied by cities. That means that if we don't look at the countryside, we are basically structurally ignoring 98% of the world, which seems a bit irresponsible. So we started looking and trying to understand images like this one, and trying to understand what is going on in this picture. And so I announce here a fourth ambition, which is to write a book on the countryside. And I hope to be able to do it with a kind of combined literary precision of Tolstoy and Welbeck, and try to record over time what we have lost and perhaps what we have gained. For me, this is a very beautiful picture. It's 1909 by a Russian photographer who was asked by the Tsar to document the entire country. And I think it's beautiful because what you see is kind of decaying architecture, but three women in front of the axis of the decaying architecture. They hold products. They are clearly proud of the products. The products are probably natural and probably related to berries. And they have national or local costumes. And what the image conveys to me is that it's a situation where everyone shows and shares a certain shared expectation of what life is about, how life is led, how you address life, how you dress for life, and what you do in life. And it has a certain nobility, which in this picture, which I took 100 years later in Switzerland, that dignity is lost. These are three Thai women that inhabit a village in Switzerland because they have to look after second houses for rich Milanese people. They wear jeans. They look after the pets of the house. They maintain the houses, and they also occasionally look after the children. And so what I want to understand in this book is the difference between this picture, and simply ask the question, what happened? And we're beginning to see partly what happened, because simply our focus on the city has made us oblivious to changes in the countryside, changes as this one, but also changes where, for instance, in Switzerland, because of reasons of meat production, different cows are being imported, so that kind of suddenly in Greek Swiss meadows you see completely unfamiliar American cows that produce more flesh and that have faces that kind of somehow don't look right in the circumstances. You see farmers, so-called farmers, but when I asked him if he was from a farmer family, he said, no, of course not. I'm a nuclear scientist from Frankfurt. And since 89, he has been kind of maintaining sections of Switzerland that were about to be abandoned. And if you look carefully, you also see that kind of seemingly familiar elements of the countryside, like tractors that have had their kind of own mythology in the 20th century as the great transformers of the Soviet Union, kind of Russia, etc., are now actually more complicated machines because they are equipped with laptops. So actually they have been becoming part of the digital domain. And basically what you see on this laptop is how each of the fields is pixelated, their yield every year recorded, so that the machines of the tractor seed and add fertilizer in exactly the right doses for each of the exact points of the field. So farming is now kind of simply watching things on a laptop and see that really the last possible harvest is extracted from each of the smallest kind of surfaces. So where this used to be the land, now this is the land. And so our tablet has kind of replaced ground, and the farmer is somebody behind the desk looking at spreadsheets, and very often able to take free time and manage his farm on the mobile, or even use drones to be even more scientific for the total extraction of the earth. So that may seem not so bad, or maybe it makes perfect sense. If you produce architecture, why not be thorough? And if the digital helps you, it can only be good. But this digital process is going and invading kind of very unexpected parts of the world. This is the combined rules and the combined laws of the EU. It's 7,000 pages. But these laws kind of dictate the transaction between agricultural producers in the rest of the world, Africa, Indonesia, and South America, and Europe. And so very, very complex computer programs are made for each and every one of these entities. And basically, the digital is also extended to these producing countries under a kind of form of constant instruction. So the laws of the EU now translated in digital information and digital kind of request, so that basically every tree in the world, before it is imported in Europe, tracked and counted and controlled before it actually goes. So that if this is a kind of typical Google image of a jungle, you now see kind of viewings of either illegal logging, kind of animals, sightings. So the picture of the jungle has become considerably less innocent and more known. And this kind of tracking of the smallest part of the countryside seems to be crucial to the new countryside, where you see, while our cities and villages are becoming, to some extent, more and more appealing and picturesque, the countryside is now increasingly the territory where enormous complexes are built according to strict Cartesian lines, that whether it is agriculture or server farms or all the other needs for our seemingly casual society, are increasingly organized in the countryside. Whether it is for food, artificial food, or servers, or the digital world, all of them occupying larger and larger territory of a kind of hyper-organization. So that what I really would like to finally decipher in this book is whether there is a kind of secret connection between the grandiose Cartesian reorganization of the countryside and the whimsicality that we pursue in our cities. Whether these two are have a kind of hidden connection, and where the one is dependent on the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rem. If you had sat at the AA, as I did, listening to Rem in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, you wouldn't be surprised at tonight's talk. Thinking a little bit outside what you would normally come to as an architectural lecture. I think we saw CCTV in one small corner of one photograph, and that was about, well, there were other things, but I was writing notes, so I didn't see. Rem may have not shown a great deal of his work tonight. And I'd just like to talk about it a little bit, because I love his architecture. I think it's very important. And it always has ideas behind it and to one side. And I do think it, in a way, it does thrive on this mixture of programming many things into a reticent background. So that symbolic shot that he ended with, of maybe hyper-Cartesian rationality combined with what he characterized as a whimsical building by Anish Kapoor and Cecil Bellman and Catherine Findlay, which I think, I may be alone in thinking I've never met anyone else who loves it, but I like it. Anyway, I wonder if you would talk, now that the slides are off, Rem, would you talk about your architecture a bit?
What do you want to, what do you want to, which aspect do you want to discuss?
For instance, I've just been in the new court, the Rothschild building, and I found that, you know, it was very Misesian in a way, and you know I'm not a great fan of Mies, but I liked your building a lot, and I liked the way you play off the grid and the abstraction and the transparency, and perform the city, and also perform the Rothschilds family and that space. I mean, as you said, it's a hyperdense space and inward in many ways. And it's, you know, the architecture is not maybe, first of all, it made me laugh, the building, a lot. Like all your work, it makes me laugh, maybe for the wrong reasons. I laughed at your elevators, which reminded me exactly of the Seagram building. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't supposed to laugh at that, but they're very visually arresting and quite upsetting if you can't focus on them because they're vibrating. And I know that Claire Booth Luce in the 1950s couldn't go in the Seagram building because she was under arsenic poisoning, and because of the vibration of the elevator core, she got sick and had to leave. And that reminded me of that. I'm sure it was not a reference in your building, but I loved the way it has, you see the Rothschilds, you see paintings of the Rothschilds, turns the Rothschilds inside out, and does it with humor and wit, and it performs the city. And, you know, it always, well, I find to be convinced by something at first, when I saw it as drawings, I wasn't convinced at. I thought it was awkward and slightly understated. I was convinced you were right, and I just wish you would talk about it. Maybe.
I mean, one thing is that recently our whole thrust has been, of course, in different countries, and particularly in the East, and that is partly by default and partly by design, but more by default, I think. So it was an incredibly kind of rare and beautiful moment to do something in the city. In the city I knew as well as I knew London. And it has taken me more than 30 years to actually like London. So it's a love for a city that developed very, very slowly. and I think that was also good. So that when I started the whole effort, it was really an incredible concentration of separate themes that had been going on for a long time. The interesting thing about London is that everything, that there aren't barely any laws, that everything is a matter of negotiation. So in the city particularly, I could negotiate the ultimate shape, the ultimate argument, and the size of the entire building with the city architect, and that in itself was a very English and beautiful moment, because almost no other city allows so many kind of freedoms and is therefore so personal. What was also interesting is that in a typical contemporary condition, the building had to be at the same time a building for the Rothschilds, but maybe if they didn't really want it, it would have to be a commercial building. So we started like a commercial building and always hoped that it would eventually be the Rothschild building, but it was not clear from the beginning. So that as their interest mounted, suddenly we had to kind of convert a generic building into a kind of bespoke building, and I think you still see some of those two sides in the building, and I actually like that very much because it means there is a kind of almost classical dedication to a single company, but also a very contemporary how shall I say it, economy of values.
It's a very symbolic building in a way, the way it uses the background to perform the foregrounds that you pick out. Unlike, say, a Miesian building, which, maybe I'm wrong, maybe Mies does it in its own way too by having an understated background. Doha and your first ambition. It's amazing. How Algeciras and Doha picked up all the BBC announcers, broadcasters who were over 42 and whose hair was going white, and they hired them as a whole and became almost overnight the best international broadcaster. So the whole BBC was bought, and you find, I think, as a method that this often happens in the Middle East, happens in China, where the West produces an incredibly high-level product and then is bought en masse and moved there. I admire politically what they're doing too in many ways. You hinted at it, but would you just say a little bit more about that rich, you said they pull it together as a whole and they think on all these levels. It does take, of course, a royal family with incredible power, centralized power, to pull all that together, doesn't it?
Well, I think that the way you describe it is kind of probably typical of the way we constantly underestimate the kind of intelligence of those environments, because we say that they bought the best people from the BBC and became the best thing, but actually there is a Arabic section of Al Jazeera, which is obviously the more important section, because we see the English-speaking version, but the really politically active and politically efficient section is completely Arabic. And so I think that there is a little bit too simplistic to say that things are bought, because in the buying something happens, and I would say that kind of the same is true of CCTV. In the buying something happens that is no longer buying, but of course, when we are in this situation, we do not deliver or even conceive the things that we would conceive here. We conceive things differently, we conceive different things, and we, in those conceptions, we develop different ambitions. So I think it's much more it's not an import, but that's why I wanted to emphasize this aspect of architecture as collaboration. I genuinely feel that in each of the operations that we're doing, we have so many conversations. And we also invest in those conversations. So obviously, on so many levels, we are so open and inviting of criticism. We are so precise in responding to criticism that I would say that whether it is a broadcasting building, a cultural building, it really is much more than simply buying or an import.
Right.
Sorry for this humorless kind of answer, but it really is crucial sometimes to really say it. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Thank you for both answers. Let me open the questions to the floor. And I think we have a traveling mic on both sides. There's one here in the third row. Abe Hayam. Abe. And here.
Hello, yes, it's Abe Hayim. Fascinating talk, and I'm glad that you concentrated on issues and the mapping of the world, the various engagements of culture and democracies, and I found that fascinating. In that same sense of mapping, what would be interesting is, at the moment architects are building all over the world, and often in some very controversial areas, places with dictatorships, democracies. What would be interesting would be to combine one of your maps, map out where, architects are building in sort of controversial areas, and looking at the sort of ethical and political aspects of whether, architects should really build there. That would be an interesting map to see, and wondered what your view is on, for instance, building in, a country like China, which has just changed its, leadership, which, with the black-suited men, coming out of the chamber after, replacing the previous ones, looked like a group of godfathers, which had taken over from the previous lot. And for instance, the RIBA has opened a chapter in Hong Kong. And of course, there are lots of questions on, the question of building in Israel with all the war crimes and illegal settlements. So I'd like to have your view on that.
Well, I think the fact that we built in China shows at least that one of your questions we responded to in a positive manner. And I'm kind of interested in responding to you. One of the reasons we started AMO is that architectural practice, on the one hand, is kind of unbelievably exciting at this moment because theoretically the entire world is accessible to some extent to architecture. But at the same time, all the issues that you talk about are very present. And sometimes you cannot even generalize for a particular country because the conditions in that country are also very different. So the situation became so complex that we felt we needed in our office a kind of research section that would explore conditions over the world before we actually were active in them as architects. And so for that reason, I went with Harvard students to China 10 years before we actually went there as architects for CCTV. And the statement that I think we make with CCTV is that, and don't forget that CCTV started in 2001, just after 9/11, and concluded only now. The The statement is that for the entire world, the outcome of what is happening in China is crucial. And we thought so 10 years ago, and I think that now, where it is generally acknowledged that the entire world's economic system is depending on the kind of vigor of the Chinese economy, I think that has become so blatantly true that there is no argument against it anymore, I think. What we have also seen is 10 years of Chinese government that did not kind of respond to our expectations, because the expectations was that they would reform and that somehow China would become more like us. And I think that was the kind of moment that I kind of suggested with the 89 end of history. We all become the same now. Western liberal democracy becomes the ultimate model. That was still in the air, but that is clearly not going to happen. And I actually showed you the diagram where the kind of blue continues to work in the different bands. But actually, although I don't necessarily want to comment on Chinese politics, I think that the past 10 years were, for many people, very, very important, because they got rights that they never had. There has been a kind of serious effort to create a certain, not only stability, but also certain position for people that simply had no position whatsoever. And we can be disappointed by the kind of fluidity, but on the other hand, I think that on the whole, I would say that it is worth supporting the entire effort, also given the incredible complexity of how to modernize and how to reinvent the politics of a kind of situation where there has been so much authority and where there is now so much pressure on changing that authority. I think that nobody knows the model that they should kind of pursue. So therefore, I would not underestimate those guys in their black suits. And I would not underestimate their intelligence. I would also even not underestimate their imagination. And I think behind the black suits there could be other events. And I think it's actually slightly irritating that we are happy with this kind of black suit as our articulation of what is wrong with them.
Thank you. Other questions on architecture? Down here.
Both of you have conversed over the role of postmodernist devices in the work of OMA. I would like to know what commentary you can give on the early works, in particular with the villas created in the 90s.
Can you say the first part? I didn't hear.
Both of you have conversed over the role of postmodernist devices in the work of OMA. I would like to know what commentary you can give on the early works, in particular on the villas of the 90s.
On the villas?
Yeah.
On his villas?
Yes.
On his?
Yes.
On your villas?
Are you asking what the role they play?
Yes.
Or what value I assign to them?
I suppose what value?
Basically, I did with Charles and for Charles and the Mega Center, and recently, and basically, I wrote a book in '95 called Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large, and that was in a way a manifesto. And what it kind of articulated is that architecture is perhaps more defined by its scale than by any other issue. And I also implied that kind of small is as important as large, extra large. And also I proclaimed that I'm at least as interested in small things. So they represent for me the incredibly important category small, which means that you can deal with kind of very personal issues, that you can have a kind of engagement with individual people rather than kind of larger groups, that you can address in a building a kind of incredibly personal condition, and that you can even, and I think that in the beginning I showed my nostalgia as an architect to be connected with good things, that you can do good things. As you know, one of the villas was for a handicapped person, and that was one of those rare occasions where you can actually do with something through architecture that directly influences the destiny of another person. So in all those reasons, it's incredible, for all these reasons, incredibly important. Also as my own personal statement, and deeply regretful that partly the constant escalation of the economy, which also leads on the one hand to kind of more abstract commissions, on the other hand, even in houses introduces a larger and a larger scale, where, for instance, the house in Bordeaux is 400 square meters, and where the last time that we were asked to do a house, we were asked to do a house for 2,000 meters, kind of 5 times as big. That is simply a scale where, for me, it became impossible to really think of it as a house, so where we didn't kind of engage it.
Very good. Patrick?
Thanks for a very stimulating lecture. I have 3 questions. The first one would be, can you reflect about the role of poetry in your research? Second question I have, what is your attitude towards market dynamics? Market dynamics, yeah. we kind of confronted with. And the third is more of a kind of provocation, I would, with respect to your interest in the countryside. Is that really an architectural issue, or isn't all what takes place in the countryside engineering issues? Because it's emptied out of people and subjects.
Well, maybe I can start with the last one. I mean, if you ask about my interest in poetry, I would say that you actually framed it differently. You didn't say interest in poetry, you said research into poetry.
Yeah, I feel that your research contains some poetry and provocation and doses of surrealism, so I wonder if you've reflected about that seeming contradiction. I mean, I think it works in a way as a heuristics, perhaps.
Well, I am constantly kind of baffled by how seriously we are taken, and not only that, but irritated that we are always considered completely serious, because clearly we are not, and we have many different streams of enjoyment and streams of adventure and streams of pleasure that go into every project, and that kind of range from, as you say, provocation to outrage to tenderness to. I mean, we try to of course keep the field and range as wide as possible, because that is one of the terrible features of our profession, that there is always a kind of sense of contraction and entropy, and we have a talent, I think, to keep all those balls in the air, and to also impose on us that insistence on all the other, the importance of the other domains. So when I say that I would like to write a book with a kind of position of combined of Tolstoy and well back, it's obviously an absurd ambition, but I would say that both of them have a very high degree of poetic content, one of explicit and overt poetry, and the second with repressed poetry, poetry of ugliness in a certain way. So it is really a crucial issue, and I'm planning to make the countryside book absolutely not only about engineer, but actually about the encounter of those strange previous forms of life that I'm beginning to kind of really explore. I'm sure it's very easy to idealize them. I'm sure there is a lot of grimness even in those kind of pictures I show you, kind of incredible, at least a very dictatorial rhythm of every day, every season, and probably also grinding poverty as one of the incentives to keep going. So I realized that a certain grimness is always part of the story, but I'm willing or interested in finding and exploring, and that is the beauty of writing, of course, that you don't know what you're going to write in advance, but it's a kind of process of exploration and also trying to explore. Maybe there is a certain beauty also in this enormity that is emerging. Maybe there's also a certain beauty about kind of farmers who can take holidays. Maybe there is beauty in considering every crop of salad a kind of single pixel in the market economy that is initiated at the moment of ordering and delivered at the moment of request. So I really cannot tell yet where the needle ends, but somewhere in that whole domain I hope to be able to operate.
Right. I know we're supposed to end around 8, so I think we can have one, possibly 2 more dying questions if they just have to be asked. So the back room.
Many thanks for this interesting lecture. Your ambitions deal with almost all the key issues that we look forward to when it comes to contemporary architecture. But we didn't hear anything about how you feel on sustainable architecture or green architecture. So is there any hidden ambition or some view that you could share on how you feel about those issues?
No, actually I think that sustainability, I think architecture has been one of the few professions that have always thought about sustainability. When I was a student here in the AA in the 60s, 68, 72, sustainability actually was taught. There were kind of people who were very intelligent about it, had enormous experience with it, and told you the ways of doing it. So I don't have a complex about it, and I think that if any profession has both invested and delivered contributions in sustainability, it is the architecture profession. So for that reason, I don't see it as a separate entity or separate discourse or a separate ambition. It is really embedded in everything we do. And therefore, I'm also not interested in breastbeating about it, because I find it crucial but inevitable and key issue. And for instance, my current preoccupation with preservation, I think, is clearly very intimately connected with the issue of preservation. I would say that even this, looking at, let's say, the map of Herodotus in terms of sustainability, I see everywhere on those blue dots where we work, both different attitudes, different motivations, different levels of investment in sustainability, but in almost all cases, a really massive preoccupation with the issue. So it's there in a kind of very intense way, and that's, I'm sure, the way it always will be.
Very good. Right. Well, time for a last burning. Sorry, one more. Okay.
Hi, Rem. Hello. I know that you began your career as a journalist and as a scriptwriter. I'm interested in knowing how that's informed the narrative of your architecture, of your design process, and if you intend to do anything with film now or in the future. Thank you.
I basically was lucky in having an imagination that can engage many different domains. And my father was a writer. Actually, he would have been 100 years a day ago, and a storyteller. I lived in Indonesia for a while, which is a country that constantly tells story on every level, and where everyday life is very close to a story. So I think storytelling is a beautiful gift in a certain way, because it is, of course, the most traditional, oldest, ancient, but once you can apply it to any of the most contemporary conditions, you can use it to kind of reflect about the past, but also kind of project it into the future. So even though very often I'm sick of it, I consider it, of course, a driving force, and yeah, I'll leave it at that. Yeah, thank you.
Well, Rem, I've never been in this auditorium and heard an architect talk about 4 different subjects and hold the audience breathlessly, listening to his words on things outside architecture, to bring into architecture. And as always, you find amazing correlations in your graphs, which I don't always see, but they always amaze me and delight me and keep me amazed. So thank you very much for giving us a lot of food for thought, for 4 directions that architecture is going to veer in as it careens down the street of history. And we follow, and we enjoy it, and thank you for everything. Rem Koolhaas, thanks.